today. Erin is a project scientist at NCAR and works in the Research Applications Lab there. A lot of work on hydrometeorological processes, extremes, which I think we'll probably hear a little bit about today. Erin got her degrees at University of Virginia and University of Albany, and then did her PhD just up the road from NCAR at Colorado State. So very happy to have you. Thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here, everyone. I know this is after lunch, so I'm going to attempt to keep you all awake and energized. So today I'm going to be discussing the influence of storm types on flooding and how they will change in a future climate. And so let's make sure this works. Maybe. Hold on. Okay, here we go. So I don't think I need to motivate why we're looking at floods too much, especially in the past couple of weeks. We've seen record-breaking floods all over the world. I grabbed a few headlines from New York Times and Washington Post where every major news outlet was talking about, these record-breaking floods are occurring on 4 different continents. And I had some reporters reach out and be like, was this climate change? Was this climate change induced? And a lot of questions about that. And so I did not have time to update this from the Hurricane Helene flooding, but even before Helene made landfall, there was this potential tropical cyclone 8, which led to a 1 in 1,000 year flood event in Carolina Beach in North Carolina. It saw 18 inches in 12 hours, which is just unbelievable. So you can see the image of the flooding here, just completely flooded streets, and we've seen this from Hurricane Helene as well, especially in the Appalachian Mountains where we've seen a lot of destruction. And so tropical cyclones, they tend to produce pretty widespread flooding. So before Tropical Cyclone 8 even made landfall, they have this experimental flood hazard outlook, and you can see it's most of Virginia and the Carolinas that were expected to have flooding. And so just because of their size and sometimes their slow duration, tropical cyclones really present this huge flooding risk that's pretty widespread. In addition to tropical cyclones, in 2023, there were pretty historic floods in Vermont as well, and these were due to multiple rounds of convection over the state, so Vermont being right here. And so these heavy rainfall over a couple days, it was July 10th and 11th, led to flooding in this region. But what really primed the event for flooding was, at least in the southern part of the state, you can see that there were pretty high soil moisture anomalies. And so flooding isn't just the atmosphere, but also the land surface really matters as well. And so this resulted in up to 7 inches of flooding in some parts of Vermont. They declared a national disaster and had a lot of destruction from this event as well. And so, as I mentioned, floods are really complex. So it's not just the atmosphere, it's not just the land surface, it's interactions between the land surface, the hydrology, and the atmosphere. And so in order to study these, I'm primarily going to come from the lens of atmospheric science, with some hydrology in there because that's my background. But I should acknowledge that all of these things are really important, and there's a lot of people studying those various components. And so before I get into this, I'm really going to focus on what is the nature of precipitation associated with these flooding events. And so before I want to get into this, I'm going to have a few definitions up here because I'm going to look at different precipitation types and how those relate to flooding. So what you're seeing here are vertical cross-sections of different types of basically rainfall. And so this is from Ramashk et al. In 2010. I believe these radar cross-sections are from South America. And so they classified different types of rainfall that they see over this region, which we also see in the US as well. So the first type is this deep convective core. So these radar reflectivities basically are over 40 dBz, and they extend pretty tall vertically. So in this case, it's over 12 kilometers in height. So you have this really vigorous rainfall, you have severe weather, so hail, lightning, flooding, and vigorous updrafts associated with this type of rainfall. They also identified wide convective cores, which are shown in this middle image here. And so it's similar to deep convective cores. It's really vigorous updrafts, and you have heavy rainfall from this. But you can see that really what matters here is the spatial extent. So you have these pretty large areas of heavy rainfall that are common in things like mesoscale convective systems. Finally, they identified this broad stratiform region, which you can see comparing to these top two. It's much shallower in nature, and it tends to be weaker rainfall. But because it covers a large area, just because it's not as intense rainfall, it can still lead to flooding just because of how large of an area it covers. And so I'll be referring to these types of rainfall throughout this talk here. And so the science questions I'm going to address today are storm types or land surface conditions more important in determining the spatial extent of floods in the United States? This is really important for flood forecasting. And we want to understand what are the most common types of flood-producing storms and land surface type combinations resulting in floods. Secondly, I wanted to understand how do these dominant flood-producing storm types change in a future climate over the Midwest, which is perfect because we're here in the Midwest now. So I'll look at how those change in a pseudo-global warming simulation. So first, getting into storm types versus antecedent conditions in floods. This is a paper I wrote with another postdoc in 2022. It's in WRR, so if you have really nitty-gritty questions, I would refer you to that. And so we looked at floods over the whole United States, and we used the 9 Bukowski regions, which are both climatically and hydroclimatically relevant for looking at these different flood types. And you can see that these regions are, they make sense both from a climate perspective, but also hydrology as well. And so the dots you're seeing, these are 671 different catchments we use from the CAMELS data set that have natural flows to really get remove the human influence from things. Within each of these catchments, we look at the USGS daily stream flow. We look from 1995 to 2017. This is to match basically all the data points together, not only just the USGS, but also we're looking at atmospheric conditions as well that were also available during that time period. And finally, for the antecedent conditions, we use the AR5 land reanalysis data set to look at soil moisture and snowmelt. And so to identify the different types of floods, we look at the daily time series of USGS discharge, and we're looking at basically if the annual time series meets at least the 25th percentile of the annual maximum, then that is denoted as a flood type. And for local floods, it can just be basically one catchment, and that would constitute as a local flood. Where it's regional floods, you have the same threshold for the peaks over threshold of the 25th percentile, but now you have to have at least 25% of the catchments have to have flooding occurring concomitantly with one another. And we tested various different metrics and thresholds, and we found that this was the right balance between getting, I think we had 1.5 flood events per year per catchment. So it's a large enough flood database that we could look at over this time period. And so you can see the number of events we looked at over this time period. So local events here on your left, regional events here on your right, and the 9 different regions. So over this time period, we see that local events tend to occur mostly in the spring and summer, which makes sense because these events are more isolated in nature, tend to be more convectively driven, as I'll get to later. And these regional events, there's much fewer of them, again, because you need that spatial threshold. And these tend to occur more in spring and winter, which again makes sense because they tend to be driven more by these synoptic types of storms, which tend to be larger in general. And so after denoting the different flood types, we have a storm classification system, which is basically a decision tree to identify different types of storms that occur in each region. So I'm going to walk you through this because we identify a number of different types of storms and their associated rainfall characteristics. So we first identify tropical cyclones. For this, we use the extended best track data set. So it basically just has 6-hour locations of the storm track. And we identify a flood of having a TC influence if the 34-knot wind radii, so the tropical storm force winds, falls within a particular region the same day as a flood. If it's not a tropical cyclone, we search to evaluate if it is due to a frontal system. And so the front we denoted by the AR5 850 hectopascal equivalent potential temperature. And we basically said if the gradient is greater than 3.5 K for any grid box, which is 1/4 degree, then that would constitute a front. This is pretty similar to what's done in the literature. So you can see here we identified a front, and here you can see just the raw theta E. So you see where you have that strong gradient is where you're going to have a front. And we tested a number of different thresholds. This was the one that most closely matched observed fronts that were identified by, I think, WPC during those days. And then if it wasn't a front, we evaluated to see if it was an extratropical cyclone. You can see an image of a really nice extratropical cyclone here. The reason being that fronts can occur without extratropical cyclones, but most extratropical cyclones are associated with fronts, which is why we did the decision tree this way. So again, just looking for basically the cyclone center being in the region during a particular day of a flood. And that is a database from Springer et al. In 2017. And then finally, we wanted to understand what are the rainfall characteristics associated with these different storm types. So we further classified based on the radar reflectivity, which is from GridRAD, which is 1 kilometer grid spacing in both the horizontal and the vertical over the whole US, except for the Pacific Northwest and Southwest. And so we identified mesoscale convective systems, which basically have at least 40 dBz over 100 kilometers, so pretty large systems. We also identified isolated convection, so again, it has to be pretty strong convection, greater than 40 dBz, but this is on smaller scales, between 5 to 100 kilometers. We also identified stratiform rainfall, which is 18 to 40 dBz, and we did it over 50 kilometers just to make sure we're eliminating any ground clutter that we could see in radar. And so this is an example of our stratiform and convective separation algorithm. So this is actually an observed case of an MCS. You can see in the south here. And then what's being identified is the convective region in red and the stratiform region in blue, which if you just kind of eyeball it, looks like it's doing a pretty good job. So in this case, this would be counted as an MCS, but you could imagine that on a separate day, you might just have this isolated convection, or you might just have this stratiform region as well. And so we basically did this for every combination of synoptic storms, which you can see are TC front or extratropical cyclone, and then we did this for the rainfall or convective types. So you essentially have 10 different types of storms that you can get, a combination of the large-scale system and the mesoscale influence as well. Classifying the antecedent conditions is much more simple. So for this, we use the ERA 5 reanalysis data. Any day there was a flood and we had snowmelt greater than 1 millimeter, we evaluated to see, does it also have a wet soil, which means soil moisture anomaly is greater than the 80th percentile. If so, then yes, it's both snowmelt and wet soils. If not, then it's just due to snowmelt. And then you can just have wet soils where it's greater than the 80th percentile without snowmelt. And then we also just had a category that was just dry antecedent conditions. So we combine the flood days, and then we look at the storm types on those flood days, as well as the antecedent conditions to look at how much do the storm types and the antecedent conditions matter for the spatial extent of floods. So first, just looking at the storm type distribution. So we have here the 9 different regions I mentioned before, and we're looking at the percentage of storms associated with all floods, so both local and regional floods. Again, Pacific, Northwest, and Southwest does not have radar data, which is why those are just due to either fronts or extratropical cyclones. You can see predominantly, though, that most of the floods are driven in some way associated with flood fronts, which are shown in blue, especially those that are associated with MCSs. So we know that fronts tend to trigger MCSs, so it makes a lot of sense that we do see that frontal MCSs make up a large category of floods that we see over the US. What is interesting is when you start to dig into the different regions. For example, in the desert and Mountain West, isolated convection is really important and associated with floods there more commonly, which we know that most of the rainfall regime in those regions does tend to be more isolated convection due to storms initiating over the mountains and not really organizing until they're in other types of regions. We then wanted to see, okay, do storm types, is there any differentiation between the local and regional drivers? The main takeaway is no, not really. If you start to look at different regions, you do see some differences for example, the Mountain West, Great Plains, and South, you do see that more frontal driven MCSs tend to occur in those large-scale regional floods and less so in the local floods. But by and large, we don't see any clear and distinct patterns by storm types and these local versus regional floods. However, if we look at antecedent conditions, this is pretty glaringly obvious that we see that most of these regional or spatial floods are due to wet antecedent soil conditions. So you can see in almost every region, we see wet antecedent conditions tend to dominate those spatially driven floods. The one interesting thing is the Mountain West. We see that both snowmelt and wet soils are important, perhaps not surprisingly, as you tend to get peak runoff when you have a lot of that snowmelt occurring, particularly in the spring and summertime. And so then we want to understand what's a combination of antecedent conditions and the storm types in driving the local versus regional floods. So if we're just looking at the local floods, what we're showing here is on the left, these left bars are showing the antecedent condition, like which types dominate, and then how often they occur with each storm type. So basically where you see a thicker line means this is occurring more frequently, this combination, in local floods. So we see the thick lines tend to be when you have wet soils, here in pink, and then associated with some type of frontal event. So in the Mountain West, it tends to be frontally isolated convection, same with the desert, and then the rest of the region is really these frontally driven MCSs that are associated with wet soils. So that tends to dominate, or I think I misspoke. I meant to say dry soils, as you can see in here. I was getting ahead of myself. The punchline for regional floods is that it's mostly wet soils associated with frontal types of events. So again, we know that that's the distinguishing factor, but we still see the same type of storms, really frontally driven MCSs and frontally isolated storms that are associated with wet soils or wet soils and snowmelt. So looking at the seasonality of the dominant flood types, we see that when you have wet soils and frontally driven events, these tend to occur in the winter and springtime, especially in the Pacific Northwest, Southwest, desert, and even the South to some degree. But we see these three regions, Mountain West, Great Plains, and Prairies, where you have frontally driven MCSs. Those tend to peak in the summertime, which you would expect because that's when MCSs tend to be at their maximum in May, June, and July. So in summary, we looked at what were the drivers of local and regional floods. We see that for local floods, storm types seem to be the main distinguishing factor, especially frontal MCSs either under wet or dry conditions. So the antecedent conditions don't matter nearly as much. When we look at regional floods, the antecedent conditions are really key, so either wet soils or snowmelt. And again, we see that those frontally driven MCSs are really important in combination with those antecedent conditions. So this could be used, maybe in forecasting to understand the combination of storm types and antecedent soil conditions to understand and predict where those flood types might occur. So I'll save questions for that part for the end, but shifting gears a little bit, we wanted to understand how does the dominant flood-producing storm type change in a warmer climate? If we're already seeing these big floods, how does that look under warmer and moister conditions? So this was a study that I did with co-authors at NCAR. It's in JGR Atmospheres if you have more questions about it. And so we focused on the central United States. I'm sure as you are all aware, there's many flash floods that occur in this region. And it's a flash flood hotspot mainly due to this mesoscale convective systems, since they are quite large and have both heavy rainfall and lighter rainfall over a really large area. And 30 to 70% of the warm season rainfall comes from these systems, which is really good for the agriculture in the region, bad for floods. So this is a screenshot I took of one of the MCSs, actually here in Wisconsin. This is when I was studying nighttime MCSs across the Midwest. So you can really see how heavy that precipitation is, especially in Eau Claire. And then you have this large area that's even cut off by the radar of lighter stratiform region, which still contributes to the flooding because it's very long duration. And then this was a study from my PhD looking at the frequency of rainfall associated with flash flood reports and stream flow indicated floods. And we can see that central United States in the red has a real flash flood hotspot, which is why we're focusing on this region. The main question is, how will climate change affect these storms? I think everyone is asking that, reporters are asking that right now. And so there have been some studies that have looked at how will the environment supporting these storms change using some detailed convection permitting models of the atmosphere. So this is one study from Rasmussen et al. In 2020. They're looking at storm ingredients and how those will change in the future. I think it was a 13-year historical, 13-year future simulation, and they show CAPE, so the convective available potential energy that's providing fuel for these storms, will increase in a future climate over most of the US. They also looked at convective inhibition, so basically the cap that is suppressing some of the storms, that is also increasing. And so what they concluded is that stronger storms will increase in a warmer and moister climate at the expense of weaker storms, which will occur less frequently. And then Andreas Prine has done a lot of work in this space looking at future changes in MCS rainfall. And they found that the MCS rainfall will increase along with the rain rate and the rainfall area. And so this is actually using the same set of simulations that Rasmussen et al. 2020 used. However, one caveat for these simulations that are looking into the future and are convection permitting is they're only doing one deterministic run. So you only have one snapshot of a possible future climate. And so there's no uncertainty associated with what's the variability in these storms and how will they change in the future. And so that's something I worked on during my postdoc, is understanding not just what's driving this rainfall change, but what is the uncertainty or model spread within some of these simulations. And so the goal was to analyze specifically flash flood producing MCSs in a future climate and using an ensemble of simulations to start to get at that question of uncertainty, to look at basically the variability in rainfall and then also the MCS structures. And so in order to do this, I identified 8 MCS cases across the central United States. The episode ID, this is from the NCI Storm Events database. So I identified MCSs associated with flash flood reports and also stream flow indicated floods. And you can see they all occur in June, so I'm trying to limit the variability in the large scale forcing. So June tends to be somewhat similar in terms of having not much large scale forcing. I also identified different MCS types. So this is kind of nitty gritty in the literature, but basically you can identify the types of MCSs by the configuration of convective rainfall, so the really heavy areas of rainfall, and the stratiform area, and how they're moving with the flow or with some sort of large scale forcing. So I wanted to sample a number of different types of MCSs and look at those in the future. And so in order to do this, I used the weather research and forecasting model, and I ran experiments using those 8 MCSs. So the current climate, I simulated using the AR5 reanalysis data as forcing data, but I wanted to get an ensemble of these storms in a current climate to sample some, variability in the current climate as well. And so to do that, I used AR5 has an 11-member ensemble that's much coarser. And so I took the difference between the AR5 ensemble members and the deterministic run, added that to the deterministic run, so you get basically just a perturbation, so some slight noise that you're adding to the AR5 reanalysis. And I did that for all 8 storms. And then the future climate is similar in that I still use the AR5 reanalysis data, but now I use a perturbation from the CSM lens model, which is a large-scale climate model that has many ensemble members. And I'm using sort of a modified pseudo-global warming approach, if you've heard of this PGW method before, where you take a delta. So I'm taking a delta, the difference between 2050 to 2080 minus a historical period. Most of these PGW studies will just take the multi-member mean or multi-model mean. In this case, I'm using a 13-member ensemble, so you're starting to capture the variability, at least internal variability, to CSM lens. So you can start to sample some of that uncertainty. And so I use 2 different WRF domains, basically to cut down on the computational cost of having a large domain. And I use 3-kilometer grid spacing, so it is convection permitting. And to give you an idea of like what do these delta signals look like that we're adding to the reanalysis data, what is shown here is basically pressure, like cross sections of height versus some of the variables that were perturbed and added to the ARA5 reanalysis data. And each of the ensemble members is shown in the light blue, and then the ensemble mean is shown in the dark blue. So for some things like temperature, there's not much variation in the ensemble members. So you might be like, well, why would you use multiple ensemble members? There's not much variation. We do see there's a lot of variation in specific humidity, which we know is really important for storms, and also UNB winds, which I think is neglected in some climate change studies because that's really going to be important for the dynamics of these convective storms. So I think that really motivates why we want to use individual ensemble members. And so we have 13 ensemble members, 8 MCSs, we have 104 future simulations that we're looking at, and 88 of the historical simulations. So we have a pretty large data set from which to sample uncertainty. And then just to give you another viewpoint of what do these deltas look like, now we just have the 2D fields. So we have the 0 to 1 kilometer surface temperature, which you can see is warming by around 4 Kelvin. And then the low level moisture, which increases by about 2 grams per kilogram over the region, so warmer, moister conditions. And then the 0 to 6 kilometer shear. So that's taken from those UMD winds, which we see does decrease slightly over the region, which again is why we want to include perturbations of the wind within these simulations. And so just returning to this convective and stratiform identification, we do it in a similar way as a previous study, but now we're identifying those wide convective cores, so large regions of really heavy rainfall, which are shown in red here, and then broad stratiform regions shown in this light blue, so large regions of relatively lighter rainfall. And then not shown, but we also identify deep convective cores within the MCS, so any really vigorous updrafts with heavy rainfall we identify. And so we can start to look at these changes. We first just wanted to understand how does the rainfall change, and then what is the variability in these ensemble members. And so this is the future percent change in the area average rainfall. So the ensemble mean is shown by the dark lines, and then the standard deviation is shown by shading for each of those 8 MCSs over their lifetime. On average, I keep doing this, sorry. On average, they increase by 98% in their area average rainfall. And you can see there's not a lot of variability. So this is a pretty robust future response that the area average rainfall will increase. However, if we look at the maximum hourly rain rate, which is a much noisier field, but is quite important for flooding if we talk about like infiltration excess, we see that the mean change does increase by 31%, but there's a lot more variability. So this indicates that this is a more uncertain response in global warming. So then we looked at the change in MCS size because changes in the rainfall area can result in different types of flooding. And so we're now looking at probability density functions of the percent change in the future MCS area. So each of the colors is a different storm. And you can see it varies quite a bit by storm, but on average we see an increase of about 41%. You can see that some storms, like this leading stratiform, has a really large spread, which we saw that some of the less common MCS types tend to have really large spread in their ensemble members, which is why we really need to add more sampling and more ensemble members to capture if there's, you know, a 10% increase or an 80% increase in the MCS size. And then we broke this down by that wide convective core region and the broad stratiform region. And we see by and large, the wide convective core region is driving most of that increase in the MCS size. So that increases on average by 75%, whereas the broad stratiform region size only increases by 40%. We also looked at the change in the deep convective cores, which those can have really severe weather impacts, flooding, lightning, hail. And we see that the number of deep convective cores increases in all MCSs. So we have box plots here of these 8 different MCSs, basically showing the spread amongst ensemble members. And we see that it ranges anywhere from 15 more deep convective cores up to 60. And so we were wondering, why is there such a large increase in these deep convective cores in a future climate, and related that back to environmental conditions. So we looked at the future percent change in CAPE, so the fuel for these storms, which we see is increasing across the board, in some regions quite a bit. And we know this is mainly due to increases in low-level moisture. You would expect more fuel and stronger CAPE for these storms. We also looked at the convective inhibition, or SIN, and we see a mixed bag in these storms, but these two that show a really large increase, I think it's this blue and this pink one, they tend to have stronger SIN in a future climate. And so we found that storms that have both stronger CAPE and stronger SIN tend to have a larger increase in the number of deep convective cores, because you have a stronger cap and you need a lot more energy to break through that, and so that explains why you have more explosive convection and deeper convective cores, especially within some of these storms here. So the final question was, what areas of the storm are contributing to these rainfall changes, and what areas are really uncertain in the models? So we looked at the change in the maximum accumulated rainfall in deep convective cores, and this increases quite a lot, 169% on average. But what's really striking to me is if you look at these box plots for each of the different storms, some of these spreads are huge. And so this indicates that this seems to be a pretty uncertain future response to warming, is how will the deep convective core rainfall change, which is in contrast to the wide convective core rainfall. You'll see that the scale is much smaller here, and the box plots, the spread themselves is also much smaller. So we see the increase is 32% on average, but we see a really small spread, which indicates the model and the ensembles are saying, hey, this is a pretty robust future response to warming. The broad stratiform rainfall, we see a slight increase, but it's kind of a mixed bag, so it's a bit harder to draw conclusions, so there's some uncertainty there. And then basically the same trends hold if we look at the area average rainfall as well, where we see a large increase from deep convective cores, but we also see a large uncertainty or model spread. Wide convective core rainfall, we see an increase, but much more robust increase. And the broad stratiform region, we're still scratching our heads at what this is, but we actually see a decrease in the broad stratiform region area average rainfall. So that's something I still want to look into, what is actually happening. Is it a change in the hydrometeors with warming, and that you have less lofting of maybe frozen particles that are melting? We're not really sure, but I thought that was an interesting result to come out of this. So in summary, we looked at MCSs in a current and future climate. We're seeing that they're larger, and you have more convective rainfall in the future. And we really see that the increase in MCS area is being driven by these wide convective cores that are increasing in area quite a bit. The increase in rainfall is mainly from those convective areas, which is much more robust in the wide convective cores as opposed to the deep convective cores and broad stratiform regions. And so in summary, storm types matter a lot for local floods. For regional floods, it's really the antecedent conditions that matter in combination with frontally driven storms, whether it's isolated convection or MCSs. And we see that the MCS rainfall increases in a future climate mainly due to wide convective cores, which show a much more robust response to warming than the deep convective cores and broad stratiform regions. So I have QR codes to both those papers here. I'm also happy to chat more via email, and any correspondence you have. So thank you for listening to my talk, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great,
Thank you.
Erin. We definitely have time for questions, both in the room and online.
Can you comment a little about the validation of these historical MCS cases, how well performed at reproducing them?
Yeah.
Can you guys hear in the back? Any questions?
I think I have, let me see, a slide on this. Here we go. Yep. This is a case of so this is a wharf case in the current climate, and then convective stratiform area. This is the observed reflectivity. So I will note, these are different scales. So this is 1 kilometer, this is 3 kilometers. It has basically the intensity, the structure, the placement, pretty much the same. The difference is WRF tends to have much larger updrafts and larger convective areas and underdoes the stratiform rainfall, which is a common modeling issue that if anyone has solved, please let me know. Because yeah, it's a big issue. But Andreas Prine has done a study where basically he showed, 3 kilometers you're still getting updrafts that are too wide, too intense at those scales. You need to go to LES scales to really properly represent things, which we know is way too computationally expensive for these types of runs. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So I think this is mostly a point of clarification.
Mm-hmm.
When you talked about how you were generating your ensemble of the backgrounds, do you run WAR for each ensemble member, or it sounded like you defined a delta and it was fairly large, and it seems like it would not be in any kind of dynamical balance. It might lead to kind of artificial behavior, or maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, let me go back to that slide.
Yeah.
Let's see here. So, here we go.
Like right there.
Yeah, so, okay, so I should clarify, so we run each of these, future climate simulations for each storm,
Right.
for each ensemble member. And so there's a really nice paper by Heim et al. In 2023, which is talking, how do we do pseudo-global warming simulations that are dynamically correct, right?
Right.
So that's the reason why I perturb both the winds and the temperature, is because that way it stays in thermal wind
Some kind of
balance.
balance,
Yeah, and then you also have some adjustment from WRF, we'll keep it in geostrophic balance as well, once you run some of the pre-processing scripts on that as well. So these are in balance,
But
even with this delta.
You're adding a delta
Yes,
that is some balanced part of a future climate.
yes,
But
correct.
you're adding that to an Era 5 current one, right?
Yes,
And how would that be balanced?
because everything that is in balance in a future climate, and you're adding, these perturbations, so because these are in balance, the temperature, the moisture, the winds, yeah. But yeah,
So you're adding some coherent structure
yes.
to an existing current day.
Yeah, so essentially you have the weather patterns of Era 5 that you're making warmer, moisture, you're
Yeah.
staying in thermal imbalance because you're perturbing the winds, you're perturbing to potential height.
Okay.
But yeah, I would refer to the Heim et al. Paper
Okay.
because we're essentially doing that, and
Okay.
they've showed that it's in balance, whereas some studies are not in any sort of balance. So
Okay.
yeah, no, it's a great question. I appreciate it. Yep.
More questions?
I have another question. And this is a follow-up with this question.
Okay.
These are amazing results, very relevant for this area, for the whole, heartland of the U.S.
Sure.
How do you communicate this to stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. So recently, with all the flooding and stuff, we've had a lot of questions. One thing, NCAR collaborates a lot with the Bureau of Reclamation, and they say, we want to know what is the maximum precipitation we can see under warming, and we need to get accurate results for our dam and water management. And so these simulations are nice because you can give a range, right? So that's something that is hard to communicate, but really important, especially for water managers, saying, we don't want to give you one number, we want to give you a range for your operations. Another thing that we've been doing too at NCAR, and not shown here, but we've been comparing different ways of downscaling data. So you can compare statistical, dynamical downscaling, and say what is the most likely ranges that you'll see using these different methods, and then taking the mean from those methods and comparing. And giving the stakeholders the information they need to make those decisions to say, okay, well, this one, we have the winds that are maybe more important in Colorado over topography, right? So there's ways of, communicating those ranges that you would expect to see. And I think also quantifying different possible future scenarios. So future work I would have loved to do is add in another GCM model, right? Because then you get more variance in there as well. I think that's really important to say, hey, this is one snapshot of what could be possible in the future. And so I think that's really important to communicate to stakeholders of like, it's not the end all be all, but it's one way we have of sampling the future climate, and you can't verify the future climate. So yeah, that's how we do it. Yeah, thanks.
I think Erin can call on people now.
Yeah, go for it.
So I have a very naive question about building on what Brett asked about this methodology, and I'm not familiar with it, but when you are doing the CSM perturbation being added to ERA 5,
Uh-huh.
do the mean biases in the model in the future also gets added up? Because I know CSM has a drizzling bias, might add to the stratiform quantification of the results.
Yeah.
But do they add up, and how much would that be of an issue, or in this type of method it's kind of like a small
Yeah.
quantification?
No, that's a really great question about the biases. So yeah, basically in this method, it does inherit whatever the parent data set biases are. So I didn't have time to bias correct. That's a whole different study of bias correcting the downscaling data, but that is something you can do. So CSM lens does have a slight warm bias. And so there's been new simulations we ran that are 40 years historical, 40 years future, called CONUS 404, where we actually try to mitigate the warm bias in CSM by doing it over decades of adding the temperature warming. So there are ways to get around it, but yeah, we did not do bias correction in this way. Bias from ERA 5, I mean, that's, observational uncertainty, which, take it or leave it. But yeah, it's a good question for sure. So there definitely are some biases from the parent driving data set. Yeah, thanks.
I have a follow-up.
Yeah.
So I'm also curious about, I think you use CSM lens, and I know that there are also high-res, or at least a little bit of high-res versions available, where the CONUS is like high-res grid and variable grid. Do you think that having a high-res resolution perturbations from CSM would help? Because it's resolving something,
Yeah.
which the low-res is not. Are you considering that, or would that be of interest? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually using that data set now. So it's like quarter degree, which is way better than like this native data set. So I'm actually using that high resolution CSM lens now to directly dynamically downscale simulations in a current and future climate over Puerto Rico. And that gets around this PGW method, which you can actually start to capture some of the dynamical changes, like the shifts in storm tracks, because you're not nudging the model and you're not forcing it to stay close to reanalysis data. So I think that's really where things are going for looking at these future things, so that you can fully capture things in a high resolution sense without having the trade-off of like, do I want a coarse GCM or do I want this high resolution PGW method, which is capturing some aspects but not all of them. And I think we just haven't had the compute power or those high enough simulations until now. Yeah, thanks.
Any final questions?
I have a question from someone who is not here but watching online, and she texted me instead of putting it there. Sorry.
That's okay.
The whole
How do
thing.
you rate?
Yeah. So Yagmer asks, you chose temperature and specific humidity as environmental parameters. Did you consider using other parameters other than temperature and specific humidity, and would these have different influences in other regions that you looked?
I'm guessing she was referring to the variables I perturbed.
Probably, yes.
Okay, yeah, so I didn't actually list all the variables I perturbed here. I think this is probably a better slide. So specific humidity, temperature, UMV winds, geopotential height, surface temperature, what else am I missing? SSTs, mean sea level pressure. So I'm perturbing basically all of the different fields that I could get from CSM lens and adding that to the original data. And then she asked if I was looking in different regions.
Do you expect there would be like a different effect in different regions?
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm looking over Puerto Rico. I think the tropics are going to have a very different response compared to the mid-latitudes because they're not limited by moisture. I think a big question right now is with the tropics, how will that change precipitation efficiency, where you already have abundant moisture, you're making it warmer and potentially moister. So yeah, I think there's a lot of questions we still need to answer about other regions, but you're not going to have the same sort of large scale, dynamical forcing that you might have in mid-latitudes that you see here.
Okay, thanks everybody. Let's thank Erin again. Have a great rest of your day. You might be able to still sneak up for one more question if you'd like to.